Needs of infants has to come from the pool of what's found in breast milk. That's the best information we have to go on. I'm not saying breast milk is always the only way to go at all, but it's a good standard for we understand, because assuming that the human body is going to make the best nutrition for an infant is probably a rational thing to do. Okay, so sorry, I'm on a laptop, so it's a little weird. I'm gonna have to move you guys. Okay, so last time we talked about energy and selected nutrient requirements, and I already gone over this, so I'll just do this briefly. So we talked about how energy requirements for 0 to 6 months. Okay. 0 to 6 months is here. Here's your protein requirements. And what I talked about in particular was how iron changes. And so this is 0 to 6 months. And then you look at the next slide, which is 6 to 12 months, and you see that the iron requirement goes way up. And we talked about this last time, how there's enough iron stores in term babies to last 4 to 6 months. Infant formula fed babies get lots of iron, so their iron status is going to be okay. Human milk provides very highly bioavailable iron, but the kids are still at risk between 4 and 6 months of becoming iron deficient. So here we go. Their food sources at 0 to 6 months. Human milk, notice how much less is what is normally found in human milk versus formula. So we add a lot of iron to formula. Okay, so the bioavailability of iron is very high in human milk compared to formula. However, this can set the stage for iron deficiency anemia if food is not offered on time, or if kids are premature. So premature infants may not be born with adequate stores, in which case around 6 months they may seriously need iron. Now, formula has a lot of iron, which sounds perfect, and it does help with iron deficiency anemia, and that's a great thing. A negative aspect of this is that it can cause gastrointestinal upset, just like when adults take iron supplements, when they need high dose iron supplements, sometimes it hurts, right? So that's the downside of having a lot, but the upside is to avoid deficiency. And deficiency matters. So this slide, I really want to focus on this in the next slide about this. So first, what do we do about it? Well, we start feeding healthful foods rich in iron around, we say 6 to 12 months, but I'm always going to hedge this somewhere between 4 and 6 months, depending on the ability of the baby to communicate, sit up straight, chew and swallow food, and so forth. But these food sources, baby food, meats, and fish, have heme iron, which I know you've learned about in the past, and heme iron is rich in bioavailable iron. Fortified cereals are also excellent sources of iron. So are beans and lentils, and eggs and dried fruit. So they're good food sources. And notice what we don't have here is junk food, donuts, Pop-Tarts, you know, the chips, crackers, Doritos, the things that we often nosh on as adults don't have any place in the infant diet and really shouldn't have a place in our diet. So it's very important for people to take these things into consideration. Now, let's have a serious point here about cow milk. Okay, cow milk should be avoided as a beverage, as a primary beverage before the age of 1 year. Now, when we say anemia is linked to early introduction of cow's milk, it means cow's milk replacing breast milk or formula. In other words, if you have a 7-month-old child and they taste cow milk or have cheese, that's okay. The problem is when they're given a volume of cow milk that replaces what they might get in breast milk or formula, or in a bottle with breast milk or formula. So that's the problem. This is an important guideline, which we'll circle back to today. So why do we care about cow milk? Here's the problem. And I often ask this question on exams. It's such a good one to understand because you get your head around this issue of iron deficiency anemia. In fact, this focus on iron deficiency anemia throughout early childhood and in pregnancy often appears on the exams. Okay, so cow milk is low in iron and high in calcium and protein, and these actually interfere with iron absorption. So not only does it not provide enough, but also the calcium and protein can interfere with iron absorption. Also, sometimes cow milk consumption can result in gastrointestinal bleeding. This could be detected with in a stool sample. There would be some blood in the stool. Parents may not see it. The stool could just be darker, but the bleeding can actually have an effect on iron status if an infant is bleeding continually. And also, that cow milk can be a problem if it displaces human milk or formula, because you remember human milk and formula both have iron. Cow milk does not. So these are the 3 reasons why we avoid cow milk as a beverage before the age of 1. Now I want to take a look at this image over here. Iron deficiency. So here's one of the biggest issues is doctors don't check on iron status until infants are the age of 1, unless they've got severe symptoms of something. So often we don't know between age 6 months and 12 months how iron status is going. But an infant may show distress, irritability, and anorexia, poor weight gain, and this could be due to iron deficiency. It may not be, but it could be, so it's something to consider. A cranky baby may be iron deficient. Any questions so far?
I have a question. When I was looking over the study guide, I noticed that you wanted us to talk about why a young child might be at risk for iron deficiency even at birth. So at birth, you said that they already have a store of iron in them already. Can you be more specific about why birth?
Yeah, 2 things. 2 things. One, I just mentioned this is premature infants. If they're premature, they develop those, and it's a good question, they store up those iron stores the last trimester. So an infant that's premature won't have the same iron stores. And one thing, I almost brought this up and I didn't, but I'm glad you brought this up, is that if mom is anemic herself, so if mom enters a pregnancy anemic or develops anemia during pregnancy, then if her iron stores are poor, then that's going to influence the iron stores of the infant.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Okay, so we'll skip over to fluoride. I have lots of information here, but just a little bit of a take-home message. I will not ask you the DRIs for fluoride. I put it here in case people care, but I do want to talk about excess fluoride. And this is going to happen it could happen if infants are exposed to heavily fluoridated water, could be well water, black tea, which is probably not a typical cultural practice in the United States, but could be, and also adult toothpaste or fluoridated toothpaste. These can be sources of too much fluoride. What happens in the case of excess fluoride exposure is what's called fluorosis. And as you see here, the infant's teeth are white and chalky looking and not our favorite look for teeth, right? So that's cosmetic. And the other issue, though, is not cosmetic. Excess fluoride can be linked to cognitive deficits in a dose-dependent fashion. This is toxicity, high doses. In the United States, fluorosis is not that common. In some, but if well water is high in fluoride, that would be an issue. So if people are using well water and they have the resources and they can get it tested, they can make the choice, if they're making formula, of using bottled water so that they don't provide excess fluoride to the infant. So that's kind of the take-home message. Okay, lead is an issue that there's lots of information about lead that will matter to you. Here is a picture of a painted wall, and the paint is flaking. If this wall was painted before the 1978, before that time, we did not regulate lead in paint. So lead was added to household paints, both interior and exterior, because it was attractive. So that's my understanding. So the paint looked better and made pretty colors. And so it was just a normal additive until we realized there was a problem. So the issue here is, you look down at the last figure, infants and toddlers living in homes that may have flaking paint, or older wood that was previously painted, or even an old house with dust in it from several decades, can be exposed to too much lead. And this is going to be particularly true of low-income housing that was built before the 1950s. Even then, low-income housing, some of the plumbing was lead pipes. And also more recently, in the past 5 to 10 years, the water pipes in Flint, Michigan. This is something that I've talked about more in the past. I'm just going to touch on here now, but the legislatures in Michigan changed the source of water for the population without figuring out that the pipes that they were using were filled with lead, and they were getting water from one of the lakes. And so what happened is, water got pumped into homes, people consumed it, and the water was high in lead. And what that did was provide a toxic amount of lead for the families. So I'm going to get to that in a minute and talk about why this matters so much. So another source besides older structures are older painted cribs. So let's say you're going to an antique show or something, like an antique sales place, and an older crib might look really cool, but there's usually a couple problems wrong with them. One is they used to space the bars further apart than they should, and infants' heads can get stuck. So that's one. And the other one is they could be painted with lead paint, and you don't want that to happen. A third choice is toys. Some toys, older toys or toys imported from China in some cases, have had lead in them. And babies chew on toys as much as they play with them, especially when they're infants. And then also leaded gasoline. So these are primary sources, but there are other sources of lead that one that comes to mind is older dishes. Let's say, and I got older dishes from my aunt many years ago, and there were these, retro dishes with big sunflowers on them. And I started giving them to my daughter, and then we both thought about it, that they were highly colored and very likely contained lead, and you should not consume glazed food off of glazed dishes or pottery that was prepared a long time ago. So those are sources of lead that can be common. So why do we care? Okay, so the exposure to lead, and this is true for mom as well as for the infants, sources of lead can cause cognitive impairment, loss of recently acquired skills. So the skill capacity of kids can actually decline, lower IQ, which persists regardless of what they do to treat it. Once the exposure happens, it happens, headaches and loss of concentration. And prenatal exposure can be serious too, which I mentioned with pregnant women. Long-term effects are here: depression, anxiety disorder. Now, how much is okay? The FDA has had a cutoff for what is a safe level for lead exposure, and it was 10 micrograms per deciliter before. Now it's determined that there is no safe level, and so the ideal situation is to avoid exposure to lead. Now, one of the treatments they use is called chelation therapy, and what that means is they take blood out of the body and run it through a column, and the column pulls lead out, and it's sort of an ion exchange and replaces the lead, and then it goes back in the body. What that can do is decrease the circulating amounts of lead, but it does not improve the loss in IQ points. So the loss in IQ points is a permanent situation. So the goal, what do we do? Obviously, public health initiatives to get rid of lead exposure and put everything we can into that. And then also good nutrition helps. So in children in poverty living in older homes may be at risk. And then also if their nutrition suffers, and particularly if their iron and calcium intake are low, then they may be at increased risk. Any questions about lead?
I have a question.
Sure.
Is that prenatal exposure, the outcomes of it, is that on the mom or the baby, the antisocial behavior and schizophrenia?
Oh, thank you for asking. It's actually, this is all for the infants, and this is infant nutrition. This is, now mom can have trouble too. And I used to tell this story. This is actually a personal story. I knew someone that was a painter, and not an art painter, but like painted bridges and stuff. And he was sort of a friend of a friend, but old bridges often have lead paint on them. And so when they repaint them, they would hang them down, in a seat, like lower them down, right? And then they're sitting there and they use this power blaster to blast off the old paint and then blast on new paint. And he did this for a while, and he started losing tremendous amount of weight, got down to, the stereotypical 98-pound weakling, and realized that he had lead toxicity from that exposure. And he eventually died from this. So lead can be very toxic. So the same thing for prenatal exposure. Any of us should not have lead exposure. Lead exposure is never good. It's a serious contaminant. But since this is a lecture on infant nutrition and the focus on infants, but it does affect mom as well.
I have a question, sorry. I'm just curious because if lead was so widely used, way back in the day, like why don't you see such a high level of toxicity among, people back in the day? I mean, is there like a specific way to get toxicity or to get exposed, like maybe through the skin or through the mouth, like orally, or how does that work?
Brandon, never apologize for your questions. I love the questions, and if I don't know an answer, I'll let you know. But this is interesting. We have had this a problem in our past. My generation was exposed to leaded gasoline, right? So whenever they stopped the leaded gasoline in the 70s, we used to get out. Before people would man the pumps, right? And then they stopped doing that, and people started pumping their own gas. You may not remember this, but then they stopped allowing leaded gasoline because of the toxicity of lead. But lead toxicity is one root cause of health disparities, because people that live in low-income housing and have these exposures to lead have the effects of lead exposure. People that have gotten away from low-income housing and so forth do better. So it's been a real phenomenon in our society.
That's really interesting. I had no idea. I didn't realize that.
I know, right? It is. And here's one other story. And this, I don't want to get off on too many tangents, but this is kind of puts a human perspective on it. I know a couple of people that were faculty in our program a few years ago. They were in interior design, and they were just here for a whole while. But interior design people do, they get into architecture and interior and exterior architecture and stuff. And so one of the people was a architect, but they bought an older house to fix me up. Now when you buy an older house, you will get information on lead because they have to do lead testing for the soil. So that's part of the documentation always. And if it's an older house, then there's going to be lead-based paint in the soil can have lead, and that is a toxin. And this could be one of the root causes of differences in IQ among kids. Anyway, these guys had this new house and they decided to fix it up. It was a fixer-upper while she was pregnant. And so they did the blasting of the paint and all this kind of stuff. And they did some of this, they had some of it done, but they also had their own exposures. And she was feeling unwell and went in and got tested, and she had the high lead levels. Now, I don't know all the outcomes of this. I just remember, because I was not their personal friend, but I remember being terrified that people that should know better, because they should have known about the lead in housing, but it may have just escaped their radar because that's not their area of training. So anyway, we all need to be careful about this, but fixer-uppers are great as long as there's not lead contamination. And actually there is a way to handle this. if, I don't know if I have this on the next slide or not, but there's a way to handle this. If you buy an old house and you want it fixed up, you can hire an organization to come in and they wear sort of hazmat suits and have their power washers and then suck up all the stuff. So they power wash, get rid of, power blow, whatever they do inside the house. So you probably can't power wash walls inside, but they blast all the paint off and then suck it all up with a vacuum, and they wear filters so they don't get any of the lead, and then they can clean it up and certify it as reduced lead. So that's something that you can do. My understanding is that's like tens of thousands of dollars to have that done. So just so you know, it's real, but purchasing a home now, you're protected, but living in rental housing or low-income housing, you may not know. I'm sorry, sometimes I feel like my lectures is just bad news. We'll get into some good news here. Okay, so I just want to make sure you guys are educated so you have every bit of information you can have to make safe choices and advise people. So this is a lecture on infant formula. And what I'll do is I'll talk about the different kinds of infant formula and what we know, how they're made, what are the best choices, and what do we know about it. My first slide's kind of fun for me. So I've been married, I'll be married to my husband this coming July. It'll be our 10th year anniversary. Hopefully we won't be bound by COVID and could go diving, but so it'll be 10 years. But so several years ago, I helped him move out of his long-term house. His wife had died of cancer and he'd been there a couple, 3 years, and they had a house of 25 years. So I went through everything. Okay. The 25 years of basic storage that people do. And I went through his baby book and I found his, the note that they gave his mother at the hospital when they sent him home as a new baby. So you can see he's born in 1951. He just turned 70. And he was a reasonable size. That's a pretty good size. This was 5 days. They didn't even measure his length. That's okay. But here's what they told him to consume. And this is what I think is interesting. Boil water. This is, you made it at home. You didn't buy, they didn't tell him to buy some pre-made formula. Boil water, measure 2 ounces of bottled water, sterile jar, add 3 tablespoons of maltose, sorry. This is just a sugar. All right, so get sugar, 6 ounces of pet milk, that's evaporated milk. So they're diluting that with water, adding sugar, adding evaporated cow milk, and then pour 3 ounces of this formula into each of 6 bottles. So then you sterilized him and feed him when he's hungry. Okay, so we've already talked about the composition of human milk, and we've also talked about how when developing infant formula, they do everything they can to make sure that the formula is as close as possible to human milk. But to excuse our generation, if we forget things, this is what we were fed if we fed formula. Notice there's none of these additives, all the things we're talking about breast milk. In fact, where are the omega-3 fatty acids? What's going on with iron? All of the components that are very important for brain development, they weren't in here. There's no omega-6 or omega-3 fats in here. Certainly not additional iron. So we were at risk for iron deficiency anemia. So I just thought I'd bring this up because I like to make fun of my husband in this lecture. And so just for fun, I threw this in here. Now, my husband is a certified geek. This is what we do. We go hiking. He's a certified geek. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met. He had 40 years of work at IBM as a distinguished engineer, and he's now by writing a book on robotics because that's what he does for fun. So obviously his horrible 6 months of diet worked out okay. I imagine he would have been better off with some nutrition, but it's just a perspective. Our entire generation was fed kind of a weird concoction compared to the ones following that, so it got better. Just bringing that up. Okay, so let's talk about the different types of formula. These are standard formulas as required by law. And in order to work with families that need infant formula, you need to know how they are made and what to recommend. So we'll talk about purchase options, and then we'll talk about types. And in a minute, I'll take a break and see if you have any questions. So the purchase options, you can buy a liquid. So that's 13-ounce cans, typically mix those 1 to 1. This is probably these are sterile, that's great. Easy, that's great. Bad for the environment because of all the processing and travel and all and transporting liquid, but it is what it is. And then there's the powder. And so typically you have to look at the label because some of them may differ, especially if you're looking at premature formula. But the typical method is 1 scoop of formula, 2 scoops of water per directions. This is important. People need to learn how to measure formula accurately. It's a really important skill, and it's something that's important to teach because we don't want to add too much formula. We have talked about this, but excess intake of protein, which would happen with too much formula per unit of water, can stimulate excessive growth. So we want to measure it right, not overdo it. And then you can buy ready to feed. Okay, so the ready to feed means you can get a bottle that's already got premixed formula. When infant formula manufacturers had their heyday in terms of working and then selling and marketing to hospitals across the world, United States and across the world, one of the things they would do is they would make these baskets of free take home, like here's your ice chest, here's your pre-made formula, here's some packets, here's some coupons. And the idea was to, of course, market this. Now, some people end up using formula, so this is a boon for them, but people that are trying to breastfeed, this can be a barrier. And so that's why some of the baby-friendly hospital initiative or the baby-friendly hospital initiatives remove this because it can be a barrier to breastfeeding. So just so you know. And we mentioned last time too, or the time before that, that some infants, especially after birth, may have low blood sugar, in which case formula can be really important in the hospital. But then the staff provides that formula. You don't need it free separately from an organization. You can get it from the healthcare providers. So the next, and I'm going to talk about powder later because there's something negative about it. It may, and I'll spoil this, but it may not be sterile. This is sterile. 1 is sterile, 3 is sterile, but the powder is not necessarily sterile and sometimes harbors bacteria, but I'll get back to this at the very end of the lecture. All right, so types of formula. There's cow milk, soy milk, protein hydrolysate, and premature formula. So these are the choices that people face. So let's stop for a moment. Are there any questions before I get on to what cow milk formula is? I'm going to assume you're sitting on the edge of your seat because this is really excited and move forward. So calories are designed to mimic human milk, and this is about normal. So again, the idea is to manufacture formula to be as close as human milk as possible. We've talked about things that can't be added in, but obviously we can make formula, especially in the United States, that supports infant growth. The protein comes from skim milk plus whey protein. So they change they don't just throw in pet milk like my husband had, but they change how they put this together. This is basically like making cake batter, right? So, or a mixture, a smoothie, if you will, to provide different ingredients here to come up with a product that's as close to human milk as possible. And so to get there, to get the right amount of protein, there's skim milks that have more casein, and so they'll add some more whey protein to make it closer to human milk. And sometimes they may have a little more protein than we want compared to human milk. And then the fats are added. And these are liquid oils, extracts. So vegetable oil is added, the corn oil, for an example, soybean oil. And they also add arachidonic acid, which is the long chain omega-3 fat, and DHA, which is a long chain omega, did I say 3? Arachidonic acid is a long chain omega-6 fat. DHA is an omega-3 fat. I will cover the importance of nutrition of these again and again throughout the semester. Right now, I want you to know what's added. So if you're making formula, start out with skim milk and whey protein, add some oil, add some essential fats, omega-3 and omega-6, the long chain ones. And the carbohydrate in there is lactose because cow milk already has lactose. Now you can make lactose free. Notice it's in quotes, versions of that have, they pull out the lactose and then they add corn syrup. And this can work for lactose intolerance, but not a condition called galactosemia where they can't tolerate any lactose. So this is a variant on the source, but normally cow milk is made with lactose. Then they throw in the vitamins and minerals, and remember excess levels of some things like iron to make sure we meet the needs of infants. And then there's additives. And it's got to be emulsified so it's consistent, just like milk, cow milk. If you drink whole milk, for example, even though it's high in fat, the fat it's homogenized, right? So it's distributed throughout. And the same way, emulsifiers are added along with some other components to make the formula have a consistent density. So that's how cow milk is made. That's a composition. Let's look a little bit at how they do it. So they mix ingredients and add skim milk. So all the things we talked about to a stainless tank. Add the fats, oils, and emulsifiers. Add vitamins and minerals, and gums would be like thickeners that and also help with that work when you heat it up. And then they pasteurize it for 30 seconds. Homogenize it, which makes it just like whole milk, where the fat doesn't float to the top, but it's homogenized throughout. And then they package it. So then from there, if it's ready to feed, it's ready to go, or they may concentrate it to make it a liquid can, or they may powder it for powdered formula. Any questions so far? All right, let's go to soy milk. This is interesting. Okay, let me go back here. Cow milk, be sure to write this down. Cow milk should be the first choice. If a family is going to feed an infant formula, then the cow milk is the first choice. And I'll get to why, but I want to make sure that you have this down. Okay, let's talk about soy milk. Now we use the word soy or soy formula. You know it's not milk, right? Because milk is from a mammal, but we use it and that's okay. But we use isolated soy protein. So from soybeans, they process the soybeans, extract the protein. You probably remember this from previous classes, but soy protein will support the protein needs of adults, but not of children. Specifically, soy protein has a limiting amino acid called methionine. And if we were to simply feed soy protein as the source of protein to infants without adding methionine, infants would not grow. So to make soy formula, manufacturers use isolated soy protein plus the amino acid methionine. Any questions about that? Okay, so just like with cow milk, they add oils. We've already talked about arachidonic acid and omega-6 fat, DHA and omega-3 fat. And then carbohydrate is added. Now notice, because there's no base of cow milk here, there is no inherent source of lactose. So soy milk formula can be completely lactose free. And that's important. We'll get down here on who should use this formula. So it's completely naturally lactose free. But notice also that formulas have sweet carbohydrates added. And I find this particularly interesting because we'll talk about how we want to help infants and toddlers learn to have a palate for vegetables, fruits and vegetables in non-sweetened items. But when we provide them their first foods with products that are sweetened with corn syrup or sugar, then what we're doing is we're setting up their taste buds to have a preference for sweets. Now, we naturally have a preference for sweets, so that's not that unusual, but feeding an infant a sugar fortified product for the first year of life may not be the best way we can set them up for health, but this is what it is right now. So the minerals question?
Yeah, sorry, I have a question. So I just have a question about like comparing the sweetness of, say, like a naturally, or like something like formula, which has sugar added into it, and the sweetness of breast milk. Is breast milk less sweet than formula? Because
Yeah.
from what we've, okay, so the HMOs, they're not like, they don't taste as sweet, even though they're like they're sugary.
Okay, so I love this question. I don't think anybody's, I've never read a darn thing about if HMOs have a taste. It's such a good point. I think not, because where we get our sweet taste is from disaccharides, right? So we get them from lactose, sucrose, maltose. So we get them from disaccharides, and the oligosaccharides are combination of monosaccharides, some of which aren't any of those, they're just isomers. So I don't think there's a sweet taste. And another example of oligosaccharides in your diet could be beans, because y'all learned this a long time ago, right? That when you make beans, sometimes beans cause gas, and it's because there's oligosaccharides in it. And so one way to reduce the oligosaccharides is to soak beans and then pour off the water, and some of those oligosaccharides are removed. I don't know if you learned that in food science or not, but that's just a fact. Having said that, not everybody gets gas from beans, but so anyway, but those oligosaccharides, my understanding, they don't have any taste. So I'm going to guess that HMOs don't have a taste, but breast milk is mildly sweet because lactose is mildly sweet.
Okay, so sorry, maybe I phrased that wrong. So what I meant was the sweetness of breast milk doesn't have a comparable effect as the sugar that we put into formula.
I don't, in terms of taste preferences, I don't, let's see, I never want to overstate anything. Let me be careful about this. There is, okay, we drink cow milk. Okay, adults drink cow milk. That's got lactose in it too. Cow milk is not particularly sweet. It's pleasant, but until you turn it into chocolate milk or vanilla milk or whatever, it's not particularly sweet. So the difference is, if you add lactose to formula, if you added it and it's the same as the lactose in human milk, that should be comparable. But when you're looking at this recipe right here, for example, corn syrup, glucose is not that sweet. It's the least sweet of all the monosaccharides. Corn syrup is definitely sweet, and sugar is definitely sweet, sweeter than lactose. So they're going to be sweeter.
Okay, and I thought I saw in the last slide that they do add corn syrup to the milk formula, right?
Cow milk formula?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they're lactose-free versions. So if they're trying to market it as lactose-free, then they'll add corn syrup to try. But see, it's still not 100% lactose-free. So lactose intolerance, it would work for, but if someone has a galactosemia where they cannot tolerate any lactose at all, then this won't work. But yeah, there are lactose-free versions.
Okay, now I follow, because I was trying to like think about why like the composition seemed the same, but I wasn't thinking about the fact that it was the lactose-free version. So thanks for explaining that.
Yeah, no, and I'm going to ask you, don't apologize with your questions, because this is how you learn. You should ask questions the rest of your life all the time. It's great. And so please, you're invited and encouraged. And if I don't know an answer, I'll tell you. And if I need to look something up, I'll try to figure it out. I've been studying this a long time. I'm pretty good at it, but I'm always open to learn. So just ask your questions. Don't apologize. Okay, so here's the content. Now they add extra iron and zinc because soy naturally interferes with absorption of iron and zinc, divalent cations. So they add more. That's fine. You don't have to worry about it, except to know that they're doing their best to make soy formula be complete. Add the essential fatty acids, add methionine, make sure there's enough carbs in there for growth, and minerals. Okay, so caution. And here's the deal about this. We know that soy contains compounds called phytoestrogens. These, the names don't matter, the genistein and diadzine is what they are. These compounds act like in the body like very, very weak estrogens. In other words, our estrogen in our body may have a certain activity, and this is 100 times less. So very, very weak estrogens, estrogenic activity, but there's the theory that they could have some physiological effect. So people worry from time to time, should we raise a child on soy, which is not, really remotely a natural milk product? But my understanding from the literature is no one's really pointed to, oh, here's the problem with soy formula as served to kids today. So in other words, we're not looking at changes in, sexual markers or anything like that that could be attributed to phytoestrogens. So it's my understanding there's not really been a red flag associated with this. Having said that, the United States is more likely to offer soy formula than European countries, for example. So they're more likely to not offer it. But I don't have a particular concern about this, except when you're choosing formula, go cow milk first. If cow milk is a problem, then soy milk should be just fine, and just relax is my advice to parents. Now, another caution here is that soy milk formula is not appropriate for premature infants. It doesn't support their growth. Now, again, if formula-fed infants but can't tolerate cow milk, sometimes we don't go to soy milk. We go on to another type of formula, which is hydrolyzed. And this advice is going to differ from healthcare professional to healthcare professional, and not every pediatrician gets their continuing education studies on the composition and details of formula. They're not going to get it to the extent that actual research scientists are going to. So let's say we have researchers at universities across the nation that are looking at the composition of infant formula, the effects on infants. They're conducting experiments to the extent possible, trying to figure it out. Physicians go to lectures or programs, and they are lectured to about these things. So they're not the primary determinants of what we understand, but they provide recommendations. If they deliberately engage in this type of education, then they could be a really good source, but sometimes they may be further behind than research scientists. And this is actually true across the board. People that are let me explain this. We may learn something about nutrition. Let's say vitamin D has some particular effect, and some studies show this. We may not see that in public policy practice for another 5 years. So there's a delay between us discovering as scientists the impact of certain dietary components and it showing up in policy. And this may be more explanation than you want to have. I think some students like to hear this perspective, and others are more interested, well, what are you going to ask us on the test? And I know that because a lot of times I'll explain something and people ask, what do I have to know? Well, here's what you have to know is these 3 bullets. We don't know if phytoestrogens are a problem, but they're there. We know they're for sexual development and so forth. We know we shouldn't offer soy formula to premature infants. And because of that, and also because of these concerns, we may skip soy formula and go to another type of formula. Now, who should use soy formula? Because this is policy, and this is pretty good policy. One is if an infant has a condition called galactosemia, where they cannot metabolize galactose, if the infant is fed cow milk with lactose in it, or any formula with lactose, they can develop or will develop mental complications and not develop well. So, darn it. So an infant with galactosemia, bottom line, should be fed soy formula. Hydrolyzed formula is okay as long as there's no lactose, but the point is soy is safe because there's never been lactose added to it. So it's completely lactose free. Okay. If the parent is a strict vegan, now we could talk about this for a full hour and I'm not going to. A vegan diet is a challenging diet for anyone because nutrient supplementation is required. However, some people are strict vegans and they want to raise their child that way. They should be given the best advice possible. So soy formula would be their choice because it's been fortified appropriately to promote growth. Now, around 4 to 6 months, their nutrient requirements may be enhanced because of the vegan approach that they will be taking. But so this would be another reason. So there's 3 reasons to offer soy milk formula: galactosemia, parent strict vegan, and then the last reason is in the case of lactose intolerance. Some infants, we mentioned that with cow milk, some infants may be able to have cow milk where the lactose has been replaced, and it may work. But some infants may still experience GI problems. So this would be when the healthcare provider says, let's change from cow milk formula that's lactose free to soy milk formula. Questions?
Can you repeat what happens to infants that have galactosemia and they intake galactose?
Yes, thank you. So galactose, if you remember your basic nutrition, lactose is a sugar. It contains 1 molecule of glucose and 1 molecule of galactose, and they're linked. That's what lactose is. When people consume lactose, then if you have the enzyme lactase, we separate them. Glucose is fine. Our body knows how to handle it. If a child has a metabolic disorder called galactosemia, they are unable to metabolize galactose. Because normally we would metabolize it, it would end up being equivalent to glucose in the liver and everybody would be fine. But if they have this condition, galactosemia, the galactose produced from digestion of lactose can cause severe mental problems that last throughout life.
How do they diagnose galactosemia?
It's one of those early tests. Like you go in after 3 days and you do a heel prick to look for phenylketonuria. They'll look for galactosemia too.
That heel prick is awful.
Pardon me?
Oh, I just said that heel prick is a horrible experience.
No, it is. You want the best for your child, and somebody starts sticking needles in its foot and it cries. Yeah, it's terrible.
One last question. I was wondering, is galactosemia lasts for the rest of the child's life?
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely, in perpetuity. So that means no milk, no dairy, forever and ever. Okay, so this is interesting. Hydrolyzed or amino acid formulas are ones where you don't have whole proteins in there. See, before when we had cow milk protein or soy milk protein, you use the whole protein from soy plus methionine or the whole milk from cow milk, you have the protein pretty much intact. They may get cut up a little bit from being heat treated, but they're pretty much intact. But when we create, there's a certain way to process those proteins to change their composition. So you start out with, for example, a cow milk protein, and they heat treat it and enzymatically hydrolyze it. Remember, and that separates amino acids. And so instead of protein being in full chains like of casein and whey, they're individual amino acids. And most infants can tolerate that. And I'm so sorry, but there should be a closed bracket right here. I'm ashamed, but anyway, please put that one there so I don't feel bad. Okay, so that's how they change it. And then, so why do we do this? We're trying to take care of the infants that have gastrointestinal problems and they just aren't tolerating the formula, and they keep spitting up and throwing up, or you know, stooling out, or they produce too many stools, and are trying to provide a formula that helps them grow, that their gastrointestinal tract will tolerate. And this is a big issue of medical nutrition therapy. And in this class, I just talk about it so you're aware of it. But you know, in a pediatric hospital, you would learn a lot more about this. So this is just giving you a framework to understand it. So anyway, so infants that have trouble digesting, then they'll hydrolyze the protein, and then they'll add, instead of corn oil, they'll use manufactured medium chain triglycerides, so they're shorter fatty acids. And so they don't have to have a mature lymphatic system. So their digestion tract doesn't have to be that good at absorbing fat yet. So no lactose. And so it'll have sweeteners added to it, but you don't want lactose, because if you've got a child with gastrointestinal trouble, last thing you want to do is add lactose to it, which could exacerbate it. And this is recommended for infants that are just intolerant to cow milk formula. And so it can work, and it can calm them down, calm their GI tract down. You just want them to grow, and you don't want them to be miserable, but it's expensive. And this is a very interesting comment here, and not palatable. What that means is it doesn't taste very good. But what's interesting about that, let's go back to talking about soy formula with added sugars. We were talking about, well, how sweet is that? Well, this stuff, because the proteins are hydrolyzed, individual amino acids don't taste that good. They're bitter. So these products are kind of bitter. They don't really, like if you were to try it, you'd go, yeah, I don't really like this probably. But what's interesting is infants get used to it, and they like their own horrible formula. I mean, we would call it horrible. They develop a taste because I guess they're growing and they're surviving on it, and they need the nutrition. And it doesn't taste like breast milk or a sweetened cow milk formula, but it works. But a weird positive side effect of this is they may like bitter flavors later on in life. So an infant fed a sweetened formula may kind of go for sweets more, and an infant fed one of these hydrolyzed formulas may be fine with broccoli. So it's just something to think about. I don't have a final statement about this. I just kind of want you to think about it. Not being palatable may not be the end of the world. It's just interesting. All right, premature formula. This can be higher in calories. Remember, regular formula is 20 calories per ounce. Premature infants may need more. And this is tricky in an entire area of dietetics, is pediatric dietetics. This is just barely scratching the surface. But so we make formulas that are more concentrated, because remember, these infants would have been in utero still. They would be getting stuff through the placenta. So what we're trying to do is deal with this complex problem of an infant born too soon that doesn't have the gastrointestinal tract capable of supporting its nutrition status, yet we have to be able to do it. So they come up with formulas that do their best, and they can't drink that much because they're little. So high concentrated calories and nutrients to try to foster the growth that's needed so they can function okay. And the carbohydrates, it depends. It depends on all of these things. And I'm not going to go into details. They may do lactose, they may do other things. This is also expensive and not palatable. For people on social programs like WIC, infants that need these products can get them through doctor's prescriptions. So there is that. Okay, my last comment here is about powdered infant formula. I brought this up earlier when I talked about the different forms. Remember, there's liquid where you mix 1-to-1. There's powdered where you add powdered scoops in water. And then there was the already mixed type of formula. There's 3 ways you can purchase formula. And I mentioned that powdered formula is not perfect. So I want to bring this up. It's not sterile. Okay, so they lose the sterility when they process it. And there can be, it doesn't mean they're going to be there, but there can be bacteria. And salmonella is one which causes diarrhea. Another one is Chronobacter infections. And this is rare, devastating bacteria that can get them pretty sick. Infants can be very sick with this. And so the cases typically occur when the infants are still home younger than 2 months. So the guidelines are, because we know about this, it's not a perfect product. Do not feed to premature infants. They don't use them in NICU. And I'm going to tell you what this stands for. It stands for neonatal intensive care unit. So NICU is a neonatal intensive care unit. If infants are premature and or they're in a NICU, we do not use powdered infant formula. If you are using it for a term baby after 2 months, only prepare a small portion at a time, refrigerate it, and use it within an hour or throw it away. What we want to do is take into consideration that it could have a contaminating bacterium that could cause gastrointestinal upset. So what you want to do is, the recommendations is wait till 2 months if you want to use it, and then follow these processes so you don't allow the seed of bacteria that's in there to grow and multiply. Formula, when you learn about food safety and food science, for example, you learn that the things like broth are really good cultures for bacteria, right? So broth at room temperature with all the vitamins and minerals and so forth can, if it's not too salty, can really support bacterial growth. Infant formula is like that too. Infant formula is like the perfect product to grow bacteria. So we don't want to mix it, leave it out, or put some in the baby's mouth, like in a bottle. And then if they don't want it, leave the bottle out and give it to them later. You have to discard it once their mouth has been associated with it. So there's all kinds of practices to make sure infants are safe. So my recommendation, should finances allow, is to wait and use powdered infant formula after 2 months, sorry. Any questions? Okay. That's the end of this presentation. And the next one is on complementary nutrition, and you don't see it. Do y'all see this?
Yes, I can see it.
You see my new slide? Okay, which this was supposed to be gone. Okay, everybody, so I'm assuming that I shared my whole screen. Got it?
Yes.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Okay, so this is the first lecture on complementary feeding. These are my grandkids eating fruit, which is a complementary food. So let's talk about what this lecture is going to be about. Complementary feeding, we're going to talk about first, before we get to that. Complementary feeding refers to the food you start giving them once they just don't consume infant formula and human milk. We'll define this in a minute. But so first of all, we need to know a little bit about what do we expect for growth with infants and toddlers? How does complementary feeding, how does it matter? And why has it been such a question in the United States? And then we'll talk about what current US infants and toddlers are now eating, which is a bit terrifying and can explain a lot of the health issues involved in our society. And then we'll go into key nutrients we need to worry about, when and what to feed, sample menus, how to feed, food safety, and other issues. So this is a comprehensive treatise on complementary feeding. One of the reasons this class goes into this so much is because up until very recently, there have been no official guidelines in the United States. I'll explain this, but people have floundered and had to go, healthcare providers give it, but we haven't had a national theme on how to feed kids 0 to 2 years until about a month and a half ago. So, background. What do you look for in growth and development? Around between 0 and 6 months, infants typically double their birth weight. So they get really big. They're tiny, 7, 8 pounds in theory at birth, and then they'll be twice that or more by 6 months. They'll double their birth weight. They grow very quickly. Compare these early years, the growth is very fast. Compare this 0 to 6 months to 6 to 12 months. So the growth is accelerated in the early months, and then it slows down a little bit. And the weight gain slows down a little bit too. So it takes 6 months to double birth weight and a year to triple it. One of the things that happens here is infants become very active. So 0 to 6 months, some of them can kind of be blobby and just sit around, and you hold them and carry them around. They don't do much. You want to try to put them on their stomach, teach them how to, push up, give them opportunities to crawl, to learn to try to crawl. Often they don't get there till 7 months or so. But so these times they do a lot of wiggling. They may do a little bit of holding their body up, but they don't really get physically active until after this. And this is when you've got the crawlers, and my son started walking at 10 months, which was just absolutely hideous. So they get really, it's unbelievable. He's like this tall. But anyway, so they get really active here, and then start burning more calories, so they don't grow as fast. So the way I look at this first year of life, and particularly the first 6 months, is they're growing a brain, growing a central nervous system. They're learning to communicate with parents for the first time. A lot of times it's hard to really get a read off of an infant for a month or so. Some parents feel that immediate connection. Some parents, it takes a little bit longer to start realizing who's home, what are their preferences. You learn how to meet their needs, emotionally, and so forth with food. So it takes a while, and then here they become active. So anyway, so this is the kind of growth to look out for. And don't underestimate, or don't read too much into this. The brain cell number peaks at 18 months, but brain growth and reasoning capacity continues. Recent studies have shown that we're still developing a mature brain after the age of 20 up to 25. So we don't just get all our marbles by 18 months, and I hope that's okay. However, brain cell number can peak around here, and we want to make sure that malnutrition is not an issue during the first year, 2 years of life. Okay, malnutrition can affect cell number and even cell size, and this can have long-term effects. So it's critical to make sure. That's why, what do? We go to pediatrician, they weigh the baby. They measure the length, they weigh the baby. They're making sure that the baby's growing. If they're not growing, we talked about failure to thrive last time, then intervention is needed to make sure that they continue to grow. Because not only their organs and their size and weight and everything, but also we're looking at brain function and maximum potential. Okay, so preschoolers slow down their growth, and that's pretty normal as well. So that just kind of sets the stage. So complementary feeding. Complementary feeding is one of, is one of the more interesting concepts of feeding young children ever. It's absolutely critical that we do the best we can. And, you know, we all make mistakes, and the world isn't a perfect place. And it's like your diet may be fine. You may eat junk food every now and then. There's room for latitude. What's going on with our society now is there's a tendency to think that junk food and fast food and prepared food is a norm. And the norm of those items is devastating for adult health. It causes overweight and diabetes and metabolic disorders and hypertension. With infants and toddlers, it can just offset their normal development. So one of the more important things, besides adults eating the best food that we can eat, is we need to make sure kids do this, because we're setting the stage for their world moving forward. So complementary foods are the first foods and beverages fed to infants along with breast milk or formula. That's the definition. First foods and beverages besides breast milk or formula. And this is why it matters so much. And I always ask this question. So please, when you're working through your study guide and thinking about how to answer a question, the question would be something like, provide the primary 4 reasons why complementary feeding and the composition of complementary foods is so important. This is an important perspective because they provide critical nutrients. So you can't start giving potato chips to a 6-month-old and hope things work out. Okay, so we need nutrient dense foods. Infants learn so much during these first few months. They learn how to work their mouth, how to use their tongue, how to bring food back and swallow it. They learn how to communicate with their caregiver to let them know whether they're hungry or they're full. They learn what food tastes like and smells like. They can learn that eating is a pleasurable experience, or in a high stress environment, or if they're high anxiety kids, they may learn that feeding can be traumatic. So our goal is to provide children with a background in healthful foods, so where they have a comfort in eating and they are competent eaters and they will consume healthful foods. That's our goal. We can't badger it into them. We have to set the stage to make sure that it works. So the foods need to provide critical nutrients. Children need to be able to learn good things from the process. Their dietary habits may track through a child's life. So I mentioned potato chips before. I've actually, I don't spy on everybody, but I've been in restaurants before where, like a equivalent of a Schlotsky's, where people are taking a 7-month-old baby and giving them Coke and chips. It's a worst case scenario, but I've seen it happen. And it's really hard for a kid consuming that kind of food to like broccoli later, or even they're not getting their fruits and vegetables. And there's so many issues with that. So those dietary habits really do matter. You know, if they eat healthfully, and then they have one tradition people do oftentimes is when a baby turns 1, this is a US tradition, they give them a smash cake at age 1. They've never had sugar before if they've been real careful. And then they make a little bitty cake and they give it to the infant. And this is a tradition. And so that's their first cake. Well, American Heart Association says don't do that until they're age 2, but it does happen. But that exposure is not going to be the end of the world. It's not a big deal. If people want to do it, that's fine. What you don't want to do is have cake be part of their food vernacular. So be careful. Their habits, the daily habits can track. And finally, and I don't like to focus on obesity so much because it sounds like that's the only health parameter we have, but it's a pretty important one. And the risk of obesity rapidly develops really early on. Many years ago, I didn't understand this because the literature didn't reflect it, but now we know these first 2 years of life can be absolutely critical for setting the child on a healthful trajectory where they have a healthful body weight. And I'll talk about pediatric obesity in a later lecture, but I will tell you that if children can avoid obesity, and they're not avoiding it, but if we can grow children that are not overweight or obese by the age of 5, they're more likely to track through the rest of their childhood years by not becoming obese. So these complementary feeding and this entire process of offering new foods and providing nutrients, this whole thing can affect their entire life. Any comments? Okay, so I'm going to stop here and ask for questions. I'd made some changes on the slide that I was going to have you write in, and we'll start next time. So before we stop, do you have any questions? General questions, anything?